The bustling atmosphere of JFK International Airport filled the terminal on a crisp autumn morning. The air was thick with the familiar mixture of coffee aromas, hurried footsteps, and the constant hum of rolling suitcases against the polished floor. At Gate B7, where a flight to Los Angeles was preparing for boarding, an unexpected scene began to unfold. A well-dressed airline staff member stood behind the counter, her blue uniform pristine, and her name tag catching the fluorescent lights overhead. Across from her, an elderly gentleman in his mid-70s was engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly tense conversation. His clothes, while clean, showed signs of wear. A slightly frayed sweater and worn-out loafers that had clearly seen better days. "I understand, sir," the airline staff member was saying, her voice maintaining a professional tone despite the growing line of passengers behind him. "But I'm afraid I cannot authorize a complimentary upgrade to first class. The flight is fully booked in that section." The elderly man's shoulders slumped slightly, but his voice remained gentle. "I've been flying with this airline for over 40 years, he explained, pulling out a worn leather wallet. "I used to have gold status, but since retirement—" His voice trailed off as he fumbled with some papers. Other passengers in line began to shift impatiently, checking their phones and watches. A young mother tried to quiet her fussy toddler, while a businessman in a sharp suit made no effort to hide his irritation at the delay. What made this scene particularly poignant was the elderly man's dignified demeanor. Despite his obvious disappointment, he maintained a quiet grace. His hands, though weathered with age, moved with a peculiar precision as he carefully tucked his papers back into his wallet. There was something distinctive about those hands. They seemed to belong to someone who had spent a lifetime doing detailed, important work. A young woman waiting in line observed the scene with growing interest. She couldn't help but notice how the man's eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses, held a depth of wisdom that seemed at odds with his humble appearance. Something about him seemed vaguely familiar, like a face from a half-remembered dream. The airline staff member continued to type at her computer, clearly trying to find a solution. "Sir, I can offer you an exit row seat with extra legroom, but that's the best I can do at the moment." The elderly man nodded slowly, accepting the compromise with a small smile. "Thank you for trying," he said softly, gathering his worn leather briefcase and stepping aside. As he moved away from the counter, he accidentally bumped into another passenger's luggage, apologizing profusely despite it not being his fault. The young woman who had been watching felt an inexplicable urge to help him, but before she could move, he had already disappeared into the crowd of travelers. She couldn't shake the feeling that she should know who he was, that his face triggered some important memory just beyond her reach. As the boarding process began, the terminal grew even more crowded. Announcements echoed through the speakers, calling for priority boarding passengers. The elderly man reappeared, quietly taking his place in the regular boarding line, his one briefcase clutched close to his side. The young woman, now in the priority boarding line, found herself continuing to glance in his direction. There was something about his hands, the way they gripped the briefcase, the careful, precise movements. She'd seen hands like that before, in a very different setting, during one of the most critical moments of her life. The boarding process continued smoothly, with first-class passengers making their way onto the plane. The young woman found herself walking down the jet bridge, her carry-on wheeling behind her, but her mind was elsewhere. She was trying to piece together why this stranger seemed so familiar, why his presence nagged at her consciousness like an unfinished puzzle. As she settled into her first-class seat, she caught a glimpse of the elderly man making his way through economy class. He moved slowly but deliberately, helping a fellow passenger stow their bag in the overhead compartment despite his own advanced age. His innate kindness was evident in every gesture. The scene at the check-in counter kept replaying in her mind. There was something about his voice, too, calm and reassuring, even in the face of disappointment. It reminded her of another voice from years ago, one that had spoken words of hope during a time of despair. Flight attendants began their pre-flight preparations, moving through the cabin with practiced efficiency. The usual sounds of an airplane preparing for departure filled the air, the clicking of seatbelts, the shutting of overhead compartments, the low murmur of passengers settling in for their journey. But for the young woman, these familiar sounds faded into the background as her mind worked to unravel the mystery of the elderly man's identity. She found herself reaching for her phone, scrolling through old photos, searching for something that might jog her memory. The pieces were there, just waiting to fall into place. His hands, his voice, his gentle demeanor, they all pointed to something important, something from her past that she couldn't quite grasp. As the plane's engines began to warm up, she felt herself getting closer to the answer. Little did she know that in the next few moments, everything would become crystal clear, and this routine flight would transform into an opportunity to repay a debt of gratitude she never thought she'd be able to address. The elderly man's identity was about to dawn on her, and with that realization would come a chance to turn an ordinary day into something extraordinary. The story had really just begun, and fate had arranged this seemingly random encounter for a purpose that would soon become beautifully apparent. The boarding process continued as passengers filed through the narrow airplane aisle, a steady stream of travelers searching for their assigned seats. The soft overhead lights cast a warm glow throughout the cabin as the afternoon sun peeked through the small oval windows. The elderly man made his way slowly through the plane, his one briefcase held close. Each step seemed measured and careful, yet there was an unmistakable grace in his movements. As he passed through first class, a flight attendant noticed his slightly unsteady gait and offered assistance, which he declined with a warm smile and a gentle "Thank you, dear." Making his way toward the economy section, he paused briefly to help a mother struggling with a diaper bag and her young child. His natural instinct to help others, even in his own moment of disappointment, didn't go unnoticed by those around him. The mother thanked him profusely, touched by his kindness. The young woman in first class watched this scene unfold from her comfortable seat. She had a perfect view of the aisle, and something about the elderly man's interactions with others kept drawing her attention. The way he moved his hands when helping others, there was a precision to it, a kind of muscle memory that spoke of years of careful, important work. As he finally reached his seat in economy class, she noticed how he carefully folded his tall frame into the confined space. Despite the obvious discomfort, no complaint crossed his lips. Instead, he smiled warmly at his seatmate, a nervous-looking first-time flyer who seemed relieved to be seated next to someone with such a calming presence. The young woman couldn't shake the feeling that she knew him from somewhere. She began organizing her carry-on items, more as a distraction than necessity, trying to place where she might have encountered him before. As she pulled out a magazine, an old photograph slipped from between its pages, a hospital Polaroid from years ago. She quickly tucked it back, but the sight of it triggered something in her memory. The pre-flight announcements began, but she barely heard them. Her mind was racing back through time, trying to connect the dots. The elderly man's hands. She kept coming back to his hands. They weren't just any hands. They were a surgeon's hands. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. Memories started flooding back. The screech of ambulance sirens, the harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital corridor, the endless hours of waiting, and most importantly, a doctor's calm, reassuring voice promising to do everything possible to save her brother's life. Could it really be him? After all these years? She turned in her seat, trying to catch another glimpse of him through the gap between the seats. The economy cabin was already full, passengers settling in for the long flight to Los Angeles. Through the small space, she could see him helping his seatmate understand the safety card, explaining each diagram with patience and clarity. The flight attendants began their final checks, moving efficiently through the cabin. The young woman's heart was racing now. She needed to be sure. She pulled out her phone one last time before the flight mode requirement kicked in, quickly scrolling through her photo gallery. There, in an old family album, was a picture from the hospital, and there was no doubt about it. The doctor in the photograph, though 15 years younger, was unmistakably the same man now seated in economy class. Her hands trembled slightly as she processed this revelation. This was the surgeon who had worked tirelessly through the night, performing what many had deemed an impossible operation. This was the man who had given her family hope when others had given up. This was the doctor who had saved her brother's life. The contrast between then and now struck her deeply. In her memories, he stood tall in his surgical scrubs, commanding respect from everyone around him. Now he sat quietly in economy class, his worn sweater and humble demeanor masking his incredible past. The aircraft began to push back from the gate, the engines humming to life. The young woman sat there, her mind made up but unsure of how to proceed. The man who had performed medical miracles was sitting in a cramped economy seat while she enjoyed the spaciousness of first class. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. She watched the flight attendants prepare for takeoff, knowing she needed to act quickly. But this wasn't just about switching seats. It was about acknowledging the profound impact this man had had on her family's life. It was about showing gratitude for a debt that could never truly be repaid. As the plane taxied toward the runway, she observed him through the seats one more time. He had taken out a worn medical journal from his briefcase and was reading it intently, his fingers occasionally tracing diagrams with that same precise movement she remembered from years ago. The weight of the moment pressed on her chest. Here was a chance to do something meaningful, to show appreciation for someone who had given so much to others. The decision she was about to make would transform a routine flight into something much more significant. The plane aligned itself with the runway, the engines powering up for takeoff. In these final moments before they took to the sky, the young woman knew exactly what she needed to do. This wasn't just about a seat upgrade. It was about honoring excellence, dedication, and the profound impact one person can have on countless lives. As the aircraft began its takeoff roll, she made her decision. The next chapter of this unexpected reunion was about to unfold at 35,000 feet, turning an ordinary flight into an extraordinary opportunity for gratitude and recognition. The plane reached its cruising altitude, and the seatbelt signs dimmed with a soft ding. The young woman sat frozen in her first-class seat, her heart pounding as the full recognition of who was sitting in economy class washed over her. The memory that had been tugging at the edges of her mind suddenly burst forth with crystal clarity. 15 years earlier, on a rainy night that had changed her family forever, this same man had stood for 12 hours in an operating room, refusing to give up when others had lost hope. The image was vivid in her mind, her family huddled in the waiting room, clinging to each other as the hours ticked by, until finally, the surgeon had emerged, tired but smiling, to tell them her brother would live. She closed her eyes, remembering how the doctor had explained everything with such patience, drawing diagrams on a notepad to help them understand the complexity of the surgery he had performed. His hands had moved with the same precise grace she had observed earlier at the airport. How could she not have recognized him immediately? The realization hit her in waves. This distinguished surgeon, who had saved countless lives throughout his career, was now sitting in a cramped economy seat. The same hands that had performed intricate, life-saving procedures were now folded quietly in his lap, holding a worn medical journal. A flight attendant passed by, offering drinks to the first-class cabin. The young woman barely noticed, lost in her memories of that crucial night. She remembered how the surgeon had stayed well past his shift to monitor her brother's recovery, how he had taken the time to answer every question, no matter how small, with the same care and attention he gave to the most critical medical decisions. Through the gap between the seats, she could see him now, helping his nervous seatmate with the entertainment system. Even after all these years, his innate desire to help others hadn't diminished. The contrast between his current situation and the vital role he had played in her family's life struck her deeply. She thought about the scene at the check-in counter, how he had accepted the denial of his upgrade request with such grace. The man who had commanded an operating room with authority and skill had stood there quietly, making no mention of his accomplished past or the lives he had saved. The memories continued to flood back. She remembered the weeks of recovery, how the surgeon had visited daily, offering encouragement and support not just to her brother, but to the entire family. His voice had always carried a certainty that had helped them believe everything would be okay. Now that same voice could be heard faintly from the economy section, softly reassuring his anxious seatmate about the normal sounds of the aircraft. The gentle tone was exactly as she remembered it, calm, confident, and kind. Her hand moved to her phone, scrolling through old photos until she found it, a picture taken on the day her brother was discharged from the hospital. There he was, the surgeon standing beside her brother's wheelchair, his arm supportively placed on her brother's shoulder. The photo was slightly faded now, but the warmth in the doctor's smile remained unchanged. Looking at the image, she noticed details she hadn't seen before. The surgeon's coat pocket was stuffed with patient charts, and dark circles under his eyes hinted at countless nights spent caring for others. Yet his expression showed only joy at her brother's recovery. The flight attendant returned, asking if she needed anything. The young woman looked up, suddenly aware of her surroundings again. Through the airplane window, clouds drifted by like scattered thoughts, and she knew what she needed to do. She thought about her brother now, healthy, married, with children of his own. None of that would have been possible without the dedication of the man sitting in economy class. A man who had given so much to others was now quietly reading his medical journal, asking for nothing in return. The weight of the moment pressed upon her. This wasn't just about a seat on an airplane, it was about acknowledging the profound impact one person could have on countless lives. It was about showing gratitude for acts of kindness and skill that had rippled through time to create futures that might otherwise never have existed. She noticed his briefcase, visible through the seats, held together with well-worn leather that had seen better days. How many hospital corridors had that briefcase traveled? How many lives had been saved by the instruments and knowledge it had carried? The revelation of his identity felt like both an ending and a beginning. The mystery of why he had seemed so familiar was solved, but a new chapter was about to begin. She had been given an unexpected opportunity to show gratitude for a debt that could never truly be repaid. As she prepared to act on her decision, she thought about how life sometimes offers us chances to close circles we didn't even know were open. Today, a random airline booking had created an opportunity to acknowledge a hero who sought no recognition, who had continued his life's work of helping others long after the accolades had faded. The next few moments would transform this routine flight into something extraordinary. A chance to honor not just one act of kindness from the past, but a lifetime dedicated to saving others. The young woman took a deep breath, knowing exactly what she needed to do next. The memories of that fateful night 15 years ago came rushing back with vivid clarity. It had been a stormy evening, with rain pelting against the hospital windows and thunder rumbling in the distance. The emergency room doors had burst open as paramedics wheeled in her brother, their voices urgent and professional as they called out vital signs. Everything had happened so quickly. One moment, her brother had been driving home from work. The next, their family was racing to the hospital after receiving the call every family dreads. The car had hydroplaned on the wet road, spinning out of control before colliding with a guardrail. The trauma team had mobilized instantly, but the injuries were severe. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and worst of all, a critical injury that most surgeons would have deemed impossible to repair. The odds were stacked against survival, let alone recovery. That's when he had appeared, the surgeon who now sat in economy class. Even in that moment of chaos, he had carried an air of calm authority that somehow made everything feel less frightening. His voice had cut through the panic, steady and reassuring as he explained what needed to be done. "Your brother's injuries are severe," he had said, looking each family member in the eye. "But I believe there's a way to save him. It won't be easy, and the surgery carries risks, but I'm willing to try if you'll trust me." The operation had lasted 12 grueling hours. The family had huddled together in the waiting room, watching as other doctors and nurses came and went. Some had shaken their heads when they thought no one was looking. Later, they learned that several medical staff had suggested calling off the surgery, saying it was futile. But the surgeon had refused to give up. Hour after hour, he had stood at the operating table, his experienced hands working with incredible precision. When his colleagues suggested stopping, he had quietly asked for fresh instruments and continued working. The waiting room scene remained crystal clear in her memory. The harsh fluorescent lights, the uncomfortable plastic chairs, the endless cups of vending machine coffee that grew cold before anyone could drink them. Every time the operating room doors swung open, every heart in the room had stopped, hoping for news. Other doctors had come and gone, their shifts ending and beginning, but the surgeon stayed. He hadn't taken breaks, hadn't stopped for more than a few sips of water. His dedication had been absolute, his focus unwavering. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, he had emerged from the operating room. Despite his exhaustion, his eyes had been clear and alert as he delivered the news. Against all odds, the surgery had been successful. Her brother would live. But it hadn't ended there. Throughout the recovery process, the surgeon had remained deeply involved. He had visited daily, carefully monitoring every aspect of her brother's healing. When complications arose, he faced them with the same calm determination he had shown during the surgery. She remembered how he had taught her brother to move again, demonstrating exercises with infinite patience. He had celebrated every small victory, the first independent breath, the first steps, the first solid food. His enthusiasm had made even the smallest progress feel like a major triumph. The surgeon had gone above and beyond what anyone expected. He had given his personal phone number to the family, telling them to call any time they had concerns. He had worked with physical therapists to design a specialized recovery program. When insurance questions arose, he had personally intervened to ensure her brother received the care he needed. Looking back now, she realized how many extra hours he must have spent, how much additional effort he had invested in one patient among many. Yet he had never once acted as though it was a burden. Every interaction had been marked by the same gentle attention she had witnessed earlier at the airport. There had been setbacks during the recovery, moments when discouragement threatened to overwhelm her brother. The surgeon had always seemed to know exactly when to appear, offering not just medical advice, but the kind of encouragement that could only come from someone who truly cared. His words had carried weight because they were backed by action. When he said recovery was possible, they believed him because they had seen his dedication firsthand. When he promised improvements would come with time and effort, they trusted him because he had already proven his commitment to their family's well-being. The memory of those months in the hospital stood in sharp contrast to the scene before her now. The same man who had commanded an operating room, who had orchestrated a medical miracle, was quietly reading in economy class, his worn sweater and humble demeanor masking his extraordinary capabilities. It seemed impossible that fate had arranged this meeting, that of all the flights and all the days, they would end up here together. The surgeon had given her family the greatest gift possible, the gift of more time together. And now, through some cosmic coincidence, she had been given the opportunity to show at least a small token of appreciation. As the plane continued its journey westward, she knew that no gesture could ever fully repay what this man had done. But perhaps she could at least ensure that the remainder of his flight would be more comfortable. It was a small thing, really, compared to the magnitude of his actions, but it was something she could do right now, in this moment. The memory of that long-ago night began to fade back into the present, but the gratitude remained strong and urgent. It was time to act, to bridge the gap between past and present, between economy and first class, between a life-saving act and a simple thank you. The young woman pressed the call button above her first-class seat with a determined press of her finger. Her heart was beating quickly, but her mind was clear. As she waited for the flight attendant, she rehearsed in her head exactly what she wanted to say. A flight attendant appeared moments later, her professional smile warm and inquiring. "How may I help you?" she asked, leaning in slightly to hear over the ambient noise of the aircraft. "I need to speak with you privately," the young woman said softly, glancing around to ensure other passengers couldn't hear. The flight attendant nodded and gestured for her to follow to a small galley area between cabins. In the relative privacy of the galley, the young woman took a deep breath. "There's a gentleman sitting in economy class, an elderly man in a brown sweater," she began, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "He's the doctor who saved my brother's life 15 years ago." The flight attendant's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine attention as the young woman continued. "He performed an impossible surgery when everyone else had given up. He stayed with my brother for 12 hours straight, and because of him, my brother is alive today, married, with children of his own." She explained about the scene she had witnessed at the check-in counter, how the surgeon had quietly accepted his economy seat without mentioning his accomplishments or status. "I'd like to switch seats with him," she said firmly. "He deserves to be comfortable on this flight, and it's the least I can do to show my gratitude." The flight attendant listened intently, clearly moved by the story. "Let me speak with my supervisor," she said, her eyes warm with understanding. "We'll need to handle this carefully to make it special." While they waited for the supervisor, the young woman shared more details about the night of the surgery, about how the doctor had not only saved her brother's life, but had given their entire family hope during the darkest hours. The flight attendant was visibly touched by the story, occasionally wiping at her eyes as she listened. The supervisor arrived quickly, and after hearing the situation, began formulating a plan. "We want to make this moment meaningful," she said. "Let us handle the logistics. Sometimes it's not just about the seat switch, it's about acknowledging someone who has made a real difference in the world." Together, they worked out the details. The supervisor suggested making the switch during the meal service, when it would feel natural and wouldn't draw unnecessary attention. They wanted to respect the surgeon's modest nature while still honoring his extraordinary impact. The young woman returned to her seat, her heart lighter but her anticipation building. She watched the flight attendants begin their preparation for meal service, knowing that each moment brought them closer to the reunion she had never expected to have. She thought about what she would say to him. How do you thank someone who gave you back your brother? What words could possibly convey the depth of gratitude for all the birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days that would never have happened without his skill and dedication? Looking out the window at the clouds below, she remembered all the milestones her brother had experienced in the 15 years since that night: his college graduation, his wedding, the birth of his children. Each of these moments was a gift made possible by the surgeon's unwavering determination. The flight attendants began their meal service preparations, moving with practiced efficiency through the cabin. The young woman watched as they worked their way through first class, her anticipation growing with each passing minute. She thought about the contrast between then and now, how life had come full circle in this unexpected way. 15 years ago, she had been the one sitting in an uncomfortable chair while the surgeon worked his magic. Now, she had the chance to offer him comfort in return, even if just for a few hours. The supervisor appeared again, nodding slightly to indicate that everything was ready. They had decided to approach the surgeon first, to explain the situation privately and give him the option to accept or decline the seat change. The young woman appreciated their thoughtfulness in handling the situation with such care and respect. As she watched the supervisor make her way back to economy class, the young woman smoothed her hands over her legs, trying to calm her nerves. This moment was about more than just switching seats. It was about acknowledging the profound impact one person's dedication could have on countless lives. She thought about all the other patients he must have helped over the years, all the other families who had received the gift of more time with their loved ones. How many other stories of hope and healing had begun with those skilled hands and unwavering determination? The meal cart paused in the aisle as the supervisor approached the surgeon's seat. From her vantage point, the young woman could just barely see the interaction beginning to unfold. Soon, a moment 15 years in the making would finally arrive, bringing with it the chance to express a gratitude that had never diminished with time. The cabin crew had positioned themselves perfectly, ready to help orchestrate this small but meaningful gesture of appreciation. Everything was in place for a moment that would transform an ordinary flight into something extraordinary, a chance encounter that would bring a story full circle. The flight attendant gently approached the elderly surgeon in economy class, leaning down to speak with him quietly. At first, his expression showed mild confusion as she explained the situation. Then, as understanding dawned, his eyes widened slightly behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "There's someone in first class who would like to switch seats with you," the flight attendant explained softly. "Someone who remembers you from a very special night 15 years ago." The surgeon looked puzzled, his weathered hands gripping the armrests lightly as he processed this unexpected information. The flight attendant continued explaining, and gradually his expression transformed from confusion to disbelief, then to something deeper, a mix of humility and emotion. "I couldn't possibly accept," he began, but the flight attendant smiled gently. "The young woman insists," she said. "She says you saved her brother's life, and this is just a small way to show her gratitude." Slowly, gathering his one briefcase and medical journal, the surgeon rose from his seat. His economy class seatmate, who had benefited from his calming presence during takeoff, gave him a warm smile and a pat on the arm as he prepared to move. The walk to first class felt both long and short. Other passengers glanced up curiously as he passed, noting his humble appearance, but also sensing something special in the moment unfolding before them. The flight attendants had positioned themselves perfectly, creating an honor guard of sorts along his path. As he approached first class, the young woman stood up, her eyes already brimming with tears. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the surgeon's face showing the gradual recognition as memories from that crucial night began flooding back. "I remember," he said softly, his voice catching slightly. "The impossible surgery. Your brother, the car accident. His hands, those skilled hands that had performed countless surgeries, trembled slightly as he reached out to grasp hers. "You stayed with him for 12 hours, the young woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't give up when everyone else had. You gave us back our brother, our son, and now he's a father himself." The surgeon's eyes misted over as she shared quick updates about her brother's life, his recovery, his marriage, his children. Each milestone mentioned was a testament to the life-changing impact of his dedication that night. Other passengers in first class watched discreetly, many of them touched by the obvious emotion of the reunion. The flight attendants busied themselves nearby, their own eyes not entirely dry as they witnessed this unexpected moment of grace at 35,000 feet. "Please," the young woman said, gesturing to her first-class seat. "It would mean so much to us if you would accept this small gesture of gratitude." The surgeon looked at the comfortable seat, then back at the young woman. "Your brother," he said softly, "he was a fighter. I just helped his strength shine through." As they prepared to switch seats, the surgeon paused to retrieve something from his briefcase, a small worn notebook. "I keep notes about special cases," he explained, carefully turning the pages until he found what he was looking for. There, in neat handwriting, were details about her brother's surgery from 15 years ago. "I've often wondered how he was doing," the surgeon admitted, his finger tracing the written words. "In our profession, we don't always get to see the long-term results of our work. To know that he's thriving, that he has a family of his own." His voice trailed off, overcome with emotion. The flight attendants had arranged everything perfectly, ensuring the surgeon's belongings were transferred with dignity. His medical journal found a new home in the first-class seat pocket, his worn briefcase safely stowed in the overhead compartment. As he settled into the comfortable seat, the surgeon looked almost embarrassed by the luxury. "This is too much," he protested gently, but the young woman shook her head. "It's not nearly enough," she replied. "But it's what I can do today, right now, to say thank you." Before heading back to economy class, she handed him her phone, showing him recent pictures of her brother with his family. The surgeon studied each image carefully, his eyes lighting up at the visible proof of how his efforts had created ripples of joy extending far beyond that operating room. The other first-class passengers, now aware of the story, regarded the surgeon with newfound respect. He was a man who had spent his life saving others, not for recognition or reward, but because it was his calling. His worn sweater and humble demeanor spoke of someone who invested in healing rather than material wealth. As the young woman made her way to economy class, she felt a profound sense of rightness. The seat might be less comfortable, but her heart was lighter knowing she had been able to offer this small token of appreciation to the man who had given her family an immeasurable gift. The surgeon watched her go, clearly moved by this unexpected turn of events. He carefully tucked the medical journal beside him, his hands still showing that remarkable precision even in this simple gesture. The flight attendants made sure he was comfortable, treating him with the extra care his lifetime of service deserved. What had started as a chance encounter had transformed into a moment of profound connection, bridging 15 years in the space of a few minutes at cruising altitude. Sometimes the universe arranges things perfectly, creating opportunities to close circles we didn't even know were open. As the flight continued westward, the surgeon settled into his first-class seat, occasionally glancing back toward economy class where the young woman now sat. His worn medical journal lay open on his lap, but his mind was clearly elsewhere, lost in memories of that pivotal night 15 years ago. During the meal service, the flight attendants paid special attention to both of them. The supervisor stopped by to chat with the surgeon and soon learned that he had been traveling to Los Angeles to volunteer at rural medical clinics. Even in retirement, he was still dedicated to helping others. "I may not be able to perform complex surgeries anymore," he explained quietly, "but there are always ways to help. These communities need basic medical care, and I can still provide that." His humility was evident in every word, his focus always on what he could give rather than what he had achieved. The young woman, meanwhile, had struck up a conversation with her new seatmate in economy class. She shared the story of her brother's surgery, of how this unassuming doctor had changed their family's lives forever. Her seatmate listened intently, deeply moved by the tale of dedication and gratitude. About halfway through the flight, the surgeon asked a flight attendant if he could speak with the young woman again. When she came forward to first class, he had his notebook open to a page filled with his careful handwriting. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice gentle but filled with purpose. "The clinics where I volunteer, they're always in need of support. Not just medical help, but funding for basic supplies." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Would you like to hear about their work?" For the next hour, they talked about his volunteer efforts. The surgeon explained how these rural clinics served communities with limited access to healthcare, how a little support could make a huge difference in people's lives. His eyes lit up as he described the families he had helped, the children he had treated. The young woman listened intently, taking notes on her phone. Here was a chance to help create more stories like her brother's, to support the work of a man who had never stopped trying to make the world better. "I'd like to help," she said firmly. "My family's business. We could provide regular support to these clinics. It would be another way to say thank you by helping you help others." The surgeon's eyes grew misty at her words. They spent time working out the details, the surgeon carefully writing down contact information and the names of clinic coordinators. His hands, still steady and precise, drew small maps showing the locations of various facilities. Other passengers in first class observed this interaction with interest, some even asking how they too could support the clinics. The surgeon's quiet passion for his work was infectious, inspiring others to want to help. As the flight began its descent into Los Angeles, the young woman returned to her economy seat with a heart full of purpose. What had started as a simple seat switch had evolved into something far more meaningful, a chance to support the continuing work of the man who had saved her brother's life. The surgeon carefully tucked away his notebook, but not before adding a new entry. Below the 15-year-old notes about a challenging surgery, he wrote about this unexpected reunion and the promise of new help for his beloved clinics. When the plane landed, passengers gathered their belongings, but many paused to let the surgeon exit first, a small gesture of respect for a man who had dedicated his life to helping others. As he made his way off the plane, several people quietly thanked him for his service. In the terminal, the young woman caught up with him one last time. They exchanged contact information, not just for the clinic support, but to keep him updated about her brother and his family. The surgeon's face lit up at the prospect of seeing more photos of the life he had helped save. "You know," he said softly, "in all my years of medicine, I learned that every life we save creates ripples we can't even imagine. Your brother's children, their future children, each one is a gift." His words carried the weight of decades of wisdom and compassion. Before they parted ways, the young woman hugged him, this time without tears but with deep gratitude and newfound purpose. The surgeon hugged her back, his worn briefcase temporarily forgotten at his feet. As they went their separate ways in the busy airport, both carried with them something precious. The surgeon had received not just gratitude for past actions, but support for his continuing mission to help others. The young woman had found a way to transform her family's gratitude into action that would help create more stories of hope and healing. What had begun as a chance encounter at an airport check-in counter had become something far more significant, a reminder that acts of kindness and dedication can echo through time, creating opportunities for new beginnings even 15 years later. As the surgeon walked toward his connection to a small rural airport, his one briefcase somehow seemed lighter. Perhaps it was because it now carried not just medical journals and supplies, but also the promise of new help for his important work, born from a seed of gratitude planted 15 years before. The story that began in an operating room during a stormy night had found its way to a perfect conclusion at 35,000 feet, proving that sometimes the most meaningful thankfulness isn't just expressed in words or gestures, but in the chance to help others create their own stories of hope and healing.